Note the presence of members here in the room in conference room 325. First to my left, Representative Amy Perruso and Representative Val Okimoto, and to my right, far right, Representative Kyle Yamashita, Representative Mark Hashem, Representative David Tarnas, and Representative Ichiyama. Participating via Zoom is Representative Della Kobayashi, and we do have also staff members present on Zoom, as well as I believe I saw Mr. Jimmy Nakatani's screen up. Also here present in the room are Chair Suzanne Case and Council Linda Chow and Melissa Goldman. And we have staff members from HMSO and my staff as well as IT present. Members, I'd like to take up a quick procedural matter first. Just for your information, today's hearing and moving forward, we have contracted with Olelo to do the broadcast of this public hearings and our public meetings. We had tried to secure the services of a court reporter to be able to have live transcription and transcripts made as needed, but we were not able to do that. So this process with Olelo will be partially in lieu of that. And the video is being broadcast simultaneously to the House YouTube channel, as well as to, I believe, Olelo channels, channel 49 on Oahu for today. Out of abundance of caution, members, I'm going to take a vote to permit the broadcasting of these hearings moving forward on Olelo. The rules do permit us to do this, and we have in fact been broadcasting these hearings on the YouTube channel, the House YouTube channel, and preserving those videos for the record of the committee. And so I just want to take this additional step because it is in our rules. It suggests that we need to take a vote by the committee. So members, do you understand that process? So my recommendation is to vote to broadcast via Olelo our public noticed hearings and meetings moving forward. Any questions or discussions? Seeing none, Vice Chair for the vote.
Chair's recommendation is to broadcast on Olelo. Chair, Vice Chair vote aye. Representative Hashem.
Aye.
Rep Kobayashi.
Aye.
Rep Perruso.
Aye.
Rep Tarnas.
Aye.
Rep Yamashita.
Aye.
Rep Okimoto.
Aye.
Chair, the recommendation is adopted.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So some brief comments, members. This is for both members of the public as well as our members as a committee, so we can understand where we are going, as well as for the participants, our subpoenaed witnesses here in these proceedings. Before we begin taking testimony in today's hearing, I would like to take a few minutes to update the public on the committee's progress and the purpose of its hearings over the next 2 weeks. For the past few months, this committee has been working diligently in its examination of the Department of Land and Natural Resources and Agribusiness Development Corporation. This includes reviewing tens of thousands of documents and interviewing numerous potential witnesses as this committee looks for ways to improve the operations and management of state government. Thousands of documents continue to be received by this committee. We will in fact be receiving additional documents subpoenaed from the Agribusiness Development Corporation related to the Kauai lands for the audit related to ADC. More specifically, this committee has held several hearings with witnesses for the purposes of taking testimony under oath regarding audit numbers 19-12 and 21-01. As the committee was following up on audits 19-12 and 21-01 and examining the findings and recommendations made in those audits, the committee was made aware that several issues involving DLNR and ADC were omitted from audit numbers 19-12 and 21-01, not otherwise reported to the legislature by the Office of the Auditor and not raised to the audited agencies. Members of the committees have also been made aware that the omissions in audit numbers 19-12 and 21-01 may be part of a larger pattern by the auditor to unilaterally decide not to report on certain substantive and critical issues discovered in the field, including in some cases criminal and potentially criminal acts. This committee believes that the omissions in evidence brought forward to the committee warrant further investigation, as these issues concern policymaking and, at minimum, auditing irregularities that should be explained, and at worst, cases of abuse and misuse of power, mismanagement, malfeasance, and/or fraud that need to be audited pursuant to Yellow Book standards. In order for this committee to do its work, it needs to understand certain issues that were uncovered during these audits but not reported, so that it may properly address the issues and properly craft recommendations to improve state government and take appropriate legislative action. So members, as such, the purpose of a portion of the hearings over the next 2 weeks is for the committee to ask witnesses questions to better understand these issues, the circumstances surrounding the omissions, actions, or inactions of the auditor, and the policies, procedures, management, oversight, and disposition of public lands by DLNR and ADC. So with that, members, our first testifier is Mr. Ronald Chiigi, former Administrative Deputy Auditor, and he's been asked to testify before the committee on matters related to detection of and response to potential mismanagement, malfeasance, fraud, and/or auditing irregularities identified by the Office of the Auditor in the course and conduct of completing audit numbers 19-12. I really want to thank Mr. Chiigi for coming forward because of the uncomfortable at times media attention that has been received by the hearings process, as well as by the committee that is really just doing its legislative job, investigating and following up on these audits. So with that, welcome, Mr. Chiigi. If you could stand and raise your right hand before we start taking any testimony, I'd like to swear you in. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I will.
Thank you, Mr. Chiigi. And I'll note for the record that Mr. Chiigi answered in the affirmative. So, Mr. Chiigi, thank you very much for coming before the committee. Members, I'm going to conduct this a little bit differently, just so we can ensure we get out some information about the basic background and information that we want from Mr. Chiigi, and then I'm going to open it up to questions in the same manner that we have done previously, which is to ask, to allow questions first by subject matter chairs, minority leader, and then moving therefore through the list. So I will be opening it up, and members, again, we will be allowing questions because it's only one witness today and this is a critical witness. I will be allowing more than 2 questions, and we will try to group them in kind of subject matter areas as we go through this process. All right. Good morning, Mr. Chiigi. So, Mr. Chiigi, just an initial question. Can you give the committee some of your background as an auditor with the state of Hawaii and your professional background?
Okay, I am currently the acting administrator for the Aegis Audit Division. And prior to that, I was the administrative deputy auditor for the Office of the Auditor for about 6.5 years. And prior to that, I was in private practice. I was the audit partner at NNK CPAs for maybe 40 years.
So it's safe to say that you have over 50 years of experience in auditing both in the private sector as well as a substantial amount of time within the public sector.
Yes.
In your work as an auditor with the Office of the Auditor, what auditors have you worked under, and can you describe some of the positions you've held within the Office of the Auditor?
I was hired as an assistant auditor, and then I was then promoted to the administrative deputy auditor position. And both were under the previous auditor, Jan Yamani.
Okay. And then you continued through working at the Office of the Auditor under Auditor Les Kondo, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then what position were you in with Auditor Les Kondo?
The same position,
Okay.
administrative deputy auditor.
Can you describe a little bit about what you did as administrative deputy auditor?
Some of the responsibilities I had was to supervise the performance audits that were assigned to me. Also, I handled the administration of the contracts with the CPA firms that were contracted to do the financial audits of various state departments. I also did the internal financial reporting, as well as was the procurement officer for the state office, auditor's office.
Thank you. So a lot of experience, both as an auditor as well as a supervising auditor within the structure of the Office of the Auditor.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Shigi, want to, hopefully we can have this testimony completed in an hour and a half. So I really want to just kind of cut to the chase. Can you describe what your role was in either the SLDF audit or the ADC audit that is the subject matter of this committee?
Okay, I was the manager of overseeing the SLDF audit. And as far as the ADC audit, I had already left the office, so I had no involvement in the ADC audit.
Okay. And as manager, what was your job as manager of the SLDF audit?
Basically supervising the audit team that was involved in the audit, making it from beginning to the end.
So we learned from the auditor in the initial hearings of this committee that there were particularly 3 to 4 phases. Can you describe from your point of view what those phases of the audit were with respect to the SLDF audit that you were involved in?
Sure. Actually 3 broad phases. We call it the planning phase, the field work, and the reporting. So that's the 3 basic sections of an audit. As far as the planning stage, in relation to the SLDF audit, the planning usually involves gaining an understanding of the Department of Land and Natural Resources, and particularly the SLDF, which is the Special Land Development Fund, which is a special fund with the department. So we would try to get information on why the fund was established. It was, I guess, statutorily established. We would get the objectives of the fund, the activities, what kind of revenues it received, what kind of expenditures they made, and if they had any, measurable key performance indicators so that we could measure the effectiveness of the fund. So basically, just a gathering of all the information we can as to understanding the department as well as that particular fund that we were looking at. So that's the planning phase. We also, after we got all of that, then we start into our what we call the risk assessment phase, where we try to identify the key activities of the fund itself. And after that's done, after identifying the key activities and assessing our risk assessment, we then prepare our objectives of what the audit will be. Then we moved into the fieldwork phase, where we actually go out and test the areas that we considered the more high-risk areas, which for this particular fund, we identified the land leases as well as the revocable permits. And part of the reason we came to that is that those are the revenue-generating areas of that particular fund. And towards the end of the fieldwork phase, we would come up with what we call a PFNF, a PFNR, which is a preliminary findings and recommendations, which we would then move into the reporting phase, which is the report would be based on the PFNR. At that time, we would start drafting the report based on the PFNR. At that time, then we would issue the draft for comment by the department.
Okay.
But throughout the audit, we would have mostly weekly meetings, weekly status meetings where we'd discuss with Auditor Kondo the status of the audit as we moved along.
Okay, these weekly status meetings would involve who, as members of the team, and where would these meetings be conducted, and what would be some of the conversations that would be part of these weekly team meetings?
Well, the status meetings would involve the audit team, myself, Auditor Kondo. And I guess as the audit proceeded, maybe we would bring in the editor as well.
Okay. So with the SLDF audit again, who were the, what would you call them, analysts?
The team?
The team. Who comprised the
audit
team for the SLDF audit from the auditor in charge and below?
What we call the AIC, which is the analyst in charge.
Analyst in charge, sorry.
That was Melissa Loy. She started out as the analyst in charge, and I think she was there through the planning and maybe the start of field work before she left the office. The Roy Kawamoto stepped up to be the analyst in charge through the end of the audit. We also had Sophie Koch as one of the analysts, Ryan Hurley, Lauren Tamanaha, and Kelly Makino, and that, I believe, comprised the audit team. Yeah.
And if you could explain the weekly team meetings, so for example, what would happen at these team meetings after the field work was completed?
After the field work is completed?
Or while the field work was going on, because you explained that the weekly team meetings happened throughout the entire process of the audit.
Yes. Well, in the planning phase, this is where we discuss where we're going to go with this audit, the objectives, the risk assessment, that type of thing. And in the fieldwork stage, we would discuss our things that we were finding as we conducted our tests. And in the PFNR, reporting stage, we start hammering out what's actually going to be in the report.
So what you've described is a process where there's a lot of information gathering, testing of the evidence, conversations and discussions amongst the audit team to arrive at the best possible product in the PFNR. Is that a correct characterization?
Yeah.
Okay. We have heard, and I have asked questions about what analysts and the audit team are supposed to do if they encounter in the field work questions that may be outside of the objective but raise issues of irregularities or noncompliance with law. Mm-hmm. Were there any instances in this SLDF audit from your perspective as the manager that were raised either by yourself or by members of the team?
There was a couple of incidents that was brought to my attention. One was the fraud. It was possible fraud on a lease document. It seemed like there was a forged signature. One of the analysts brought it to my attention, and I told him at that time that I think we should gather more evidence to see if it actually was a forged document. And we brought it up at one of these status meetings to Auditor Kondo that there could be a possible fraud occurring here because of the forged document.
And the analyst who brought this to the attention of yourself and the team was who in the team?
I think it was both Sophie Koch and Ryan Hurley, if I remember correctly.
Okay. Can you explain, and I think this is critical because we want to understand when this possible fraud or forged document was detected. Can you explain, if you can recall, was Sophie and Ryan employed by the Office of the Auditor throughout this whole duration and working on the audit at the same time, or can you recall the sequencing of their employment?
both Ryan and Sophie had left the office prior to the completion of the audit. But this was brought to my attention during the fieldwork phase while they were testing the leases that we sampled.
Can you recall, and I should have started this out initially, but do you recall when the planning phase started? And only if you can recall.
The planning phase starts when we received the request from the legislature to authorize us to do this audit. So it probably started around June, July of 2017, right after the session ended. And generally the planning stage maybe takes a couple of months.
So would you say that the field work was potentially in August of 2017?
Yes, at that time, the request from the legislature was that we audit two funds from the Department of Land and Natural Resources. One was the Sldf fund and one was the Land Conservation Fund. So we started, I guess, simultaneously planning for both audits. But I think we concentrated on the Land Conservation Fund first, but we still did both audits together.
Okay.
So the timing gets a little gray here, hazy.
It's a while ago.
It was back in 2017.
Okay, so fieldwork is around August 2017, and you said that both Sophie and Ryan brought the possible fraud to your attention.
During the fieldwork phase.
During the fieldwork phase, so sometime in August 2017.
August or later.
Or later. And you don't know who discovered the possible fraud, do you? So whether it was Sophie or it was Ryan?
No, I don't.
Okay. When they brought it up to the audit team meetings, can you again describe for the committee the conversations around that possible fraud, and then what steps were taken after it was discussed amongst the team?
I remember discussing with Ryan that we needed to get more evidence to see if this was actually a forged document. I know we discussed it at these status meetings with Auditor Kondo. I know there was much discussion, but I don't remember the details.
Okay. And the ultimate further auditing of this potential fraud document, did the audit team do anything further after these meetings?
As far as I remember, we did not pursue it, and it never got into the report.
Who would have made the ultimate decision about whether or not to pursue further auditing the discovery of a forged document?
Well, Auditor Kondo makes the final decision and has the ultimate responsibility for the report.
Okay. You mentioned that there were other irregularities you noticed. Is there anything else that you can recall that was discussed?
I know I brought up at this meeting, the status meeting, that I noticed that a lessee, which was a nonprofit organization, had lost its status as a nonprofit by the IRS because it had failed to file its nonprofit tax returns. So I guess I was concerned whether or not that would jeopardize the lease itself, because it was between this DLNR and this lessee, which was a nonprofit, which after the IRS revokes its nonprofit status, then it's no longer a nonprofit. So I don't know how it would affect the lease agreement itself, whether it's to be a valid agreement with a nonprofit. And also, nonprofit entities generally get a break on the amount of lease amount that's charged because it's a nonprofit. So, but I didn't go far enough to pursue this because Auditor Kondo didn't feel it was a significant matter.
So in terms of who you disclosed this concern to, did you disclose this concern to Auditor Kondo?
Yes, I did.
Did you disclose this concern to the entire audit team?
To specific members of the audit team.
What specific members did you disclose to, if you can recall?
I can't remember.
But you did disclose it, you believe?
I did disclose to some members of the audit team. Throughout the audit, members were leaving the office, so the team got smaller and smaller. So I don't remember who I spoke to at that time.
And the ultimate direction was to not follow up further?
Yes.
Is that correct? And that direction came from who?
Auditor Kondo.
Okay. I just have a few more question, members, and then I will open it up. We got to the phase of the PFNR and the reporting phase for the SLDF. My understanding from the presentation by Auditor Kondo is that there's also an independent review phase.
Yes.
And can you explain that part of the phase and what happened in that part of the phase for the SLDF audit?
Before the draft goes out to the department, an independent review is performed by someone within the office that was not involved in the audit to make sure that everything that's in the report is supported by a work paper or reference.
And in this case, who was the independent reviewer, if you can recall?
The independent reviewer for the SLDF audit was Valerie Inuma. She was a manager with the office at that time. She's no longer with the office, though.
Okay. And can you further explain how this independent reviewer verifies, I believe, or reviews the work?
She would take the draft report and compare the report itself to, and the report is referenced. Every line, every sentence is referenced to a work paper, and so she would compare the references to make sure the report is supported by a work paper.
Would the discussions or the concerns about the possible fraud or the loss of the nonprofit status have appeared in the work papers?
I know the nonprofit status did not.
Okay.
I did not write it up after we weren't going to pursue it, so I didn't write it up. As far as the fraud, I don't remember if there were documents within the work papers.
Okay. If the independent reviewer had seen documentation of concerns that had been omitted, would it have been the independent reviewer's job to then note for the final completion of the report that maybe there should have been something additional added?
No, I think it was more that whatever is in the report is supported by the work papers.
Okay, so at that point, the independent reviewer would not have been knowledgeable of the matters that were omitted?
Yes, would not be knowledgeable. Yep.
Okay. Can you comment on the use of recorded interviews during this audit process?
The office records interviews with the auditee as part of their practice, current practice. As far as my experience is that we never use recorded interviews in all my years in auditing, both in private practice as well as with the state auditor's office and currently at DAGS.
Would did you say?
Because it's not a standard practice to record these interviews.
What would have been standard practice for the conducting of interviews?
I'm sorry?
What would have been
We
the
would
standard
just-
practice?
We would just take notes.
Would it be one audit team member, 2, 3?
It'd be 2 audit team members, one asking the questions, another taking the notes.
Okay.
Okay, and that's how it was when I got there at the state auditor's office.
Were you ever given any instructions on how to conduct the recorded interviews pursuant to policies and procedures in the office?
Well, I know when we first started to record the interviews, I know the auditee would be apprehensive because it's being recorded. But we would tell them that it is for our purposes, which is that we might miss something when we're taking handwritten notes. So these recorded interviews would be helpful in making sure that we got everything that was the auditee said in these interviews. And also it was mentioned that, and these interviews, these recorded interviews would be confidential because it'd be part of the work papers of the audit.
Was there ever a process to provide interviewees copies of the recordings or transcripts?
If the auditee requests that they have a copy of the interview, that would have to be Auditor's Condo's call because it's now part of the confidential work papers, these recorded interviews.
Okay. So it was to be determined by Auditor Kondo, and there was no standard practice. A request could be made, but there was no standard practice as to whether it would be turned over or not.
Yes.
Okay.
There was no standard practice, right?
Okay. One final question is to kind of wrap all of this up. So after the independent review is conducted, how quickly after the independent review is conducted is then the draft report provided to the audited agency?
After the independent review is completed, I would say within a couple of weeks, I would think, a week or two, I don't know, to finalize the report. If there's no edits to be made, I think it would be within a couple of weeks.
Okay. And then in the case of the Sldf audit, between the time when the independent review was completed and when it was provided, can you recall the events around providing DLNR with the draft findings?
The timing?
The timing
No.
of the providing of the draft findings and recommendations to DLNR?
No, I don't recall.
Okay.
I don't recall. I'm sorry. I think the report was issued in June of 2019, the final report.
Any other comments you'd like to make about the entire process and phase from planning, fieldwork, reporting to independent review that you'd like to share with the committee before I turn over questions to members of the committee?
Maybe on the recorded interviews, because we tell the auditee that it's be confidential because it's not part of the audit work papers, but yet the office would take phrases or comments from those interviews and put it in the report. So I didn't feel comfortable in that type of. All it did was we already had the finding in report. I don't think we needed to have comments from whoever said, like a board member might have said something, and we put that in as well. It just elevated that finding to make it more dramatic, I guess, would be a term.
Just so I'll follow up on this question, the use of quotes, direct quotes in that manner, is that a usual practice of audit reports, or was that an unusual practice?
I would say it's not a standard practice.
And why wouldn't it? Why isn't it typically a standard practice to focus in on bits and pieces of recorded interviews?
For one thing, we already told the auditee that it's whatever you have, whatever we say or you record it is confidential. So it's almost like we're breaching the trust to the auditee if we're going to quote them right in the report, which is a public report.
And then one follow-up on this question.
Okay.
I have delved into the Yellow Book standards quite in depth, and so is there an order of authority or respect accorded different types of evidence within the Yellow Book standards, if you can share that with the committee?
I'm sorry.
So is there a difference between documentary evidence versus testimony? Is there a difference in the status that's provided to each type of
Interview
evidence?
type of evidence is probably the lowest form of evidence. It'd be better to have a hard, tangible document than someone telling you something. So that would be the lowest form of evidence if you had a hierarchy.
Okay, and the highest form would be documents such as board minutes?
Like a forged document or something that we found that is incorrect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that education. All right, members, I'm going to turn this over
Sure.
to other members of the committee. So first up is Representative David Tarnas.
Thank you, Mr. Shigi, for being here today. Appreciate it very much. Usually my questions are about policy issues and such, but because of your job, I'm going to be asking more process-related questions because I'm not an auditor, and I'm learning a lot from you and others about this. Could you explain to me what the risk management, risk analysis would be that the auditor would have to go through to decide whether to include something or not? For example, you mentioned the potential forgery issue, you mentioned this nonprofit status issue. What is the analysis that would be done by the auditor to decide whether or not to include it in the audit or to report it to the agency or to legislative leaders?
Well, we call it the risk assessment, and what we do is we list down the key activities, and in this case, the fund itself. What are the key activities of the fund? And some of the areas we were going to look at is the revenue source, as well as the expenditure types. The revenue source meaning the fund itself receives millions of dollars in revenues and supports many programs. So it was critical that we understand how these leases or how these permits are awarded, renewed, and how they determine what analysis are being performed, especially when it comes time for renewal, if they had that type of thing. So we found that that particular was a high-risk area, knowing that the department didn't seem to have written policies and procedures as far as in this area of operations.
Okay. In terms of the the evaluation of whether to include, you mentioned the two different findings that you had brought to the auditor. Did it make sense to you, his analysis and conclusions about whether to include them in the audit?
As far as the forged document, I don't recall all the discussions that went on. So I don't remember on why it was not included. As far as the tax situation, since I brought it up, I thought it could be a finding that be involved. It could have been reported. I wasn't sure if the lease agreement would be valid anymore, that type of thing. So, but since he didn't want to pursue it, we just dropped it as well.
Okay, thanks. Let me just switch to another area of, we've heard from a number of different people concerns about conflicts of interest, and I would like to understand better how that is handled within the auditor's office. While the Sldf audit was being undertaken, do you know if there were other former employees of the land division that worked as auditors in the auditor's office?
Yes, but they were not assigned as part of the audit team.
For the Sldf audit?
The Sldf audit, right. Before we even start the audit, as we make the assignments as who the team members would be, they would have to sign off a form that says that they have, it's like an independence form that the auditor has, the auditor's office has, which if they had a conflict of interest, they would put it on that form, and then the auditor Kondo would decide whether or not there is a conflict of interest. But in most cases, there usually isn't a conflict of interest, so they would sign the form as they would be independent of the audited entity.
Okay.
Okay.
The auditor has told us that there was they called it a China wall in between the two audits that were done, because as you said, they were done simultaneously. Was that sufficient? Could there have been some conversations between the two teams, even though there was this division?
No. You're talking about the two former employees of the LNR?
Yes.
No, they weren't part of the audit team.
So, but they were working on another audit.
They were working on some other project.
Some other project. Okay, but so you felt that China wall, so-called China, would be sufficient to separate them from any undue influence on the Sldf audit team?
Yes.
Okay. I'm curious about the decision to move forward with the. Actually, no. I'll defer those questions. I'll give it back to you, Chair, and then I've already asked a couple more than my share, so I'll come back to these questions afterward. Let me turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Rep. Tarnas. Rep. Okimoto, questions for you?
No questions, Chair. Thank you.
Rep. Kobayashi on Zoom, any questions from you?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Hi. So, Mr. Shige, you had. I want to just go to the issues relating to the fraudulent email. So, you answered questions, I believe, fairly truthfully, as far as your knowledge on this incident. But what's baffling to me is that as the field in charge on this audit, obviously you were aware that this fraudulent email was something known by everybody in management of the agency, that this had already been prosecuted. It's been raised by the Attorney General. The individual who did the fraudulent email had been prosecuted. So, I mean, you answer questions along the line of, well, this awful fraud was uncovered by, young conscientious whistleblowers, brought to the attention of management who buried this thing. But what you fail to mention, which obviously you're aware of, is that this had already been known by everybody. It had already been taken care of by the Attorney General and prosecuted. So why would you not have that comment as well? I mean, I think you have a responsibility more than just answering questions yes or no, right? If you understand the reasons why it'd be ridiculous to report this because everybody already knew about it. It already played out. Wouldn't you mention that here in the committee?
Well, we didn't know. I didn't know. The team didn't know that it was already prosecuted. We did not know whatever you just said.
Do you know now?
Now?
Do you not know now?
No, I did not know.
So as the field in charge, when this thing was discussed, it was not, you didn't do anything determined whether this had already been made known to management?
As far as I know, no.
Baffling. So you believe that to this point, that this is something that had not been already discovered and played out, where the person who did the email, I mean, your discussion is so cryptic on this, and as the field in charge, it's really hard to believe that you would have such a lack of understanding of this situation.
That's correct. We did not know. What can I tell you?
You did not know about this,
No.
and you continue
I'm
to
assuming
not
the
know.
audit team did not know as well.
I'm going to ask a clarifying question, Rep. Kobayashi. So to make the question very clear, when it was raised by the field work, what was raised was an alleged
Yes.
forged document.
Right.
You discussed it amongst the team and did not further follow up on the status of the forged document.
Well, we had told them to see if they can find more information as to is this really a forged document?
Okay.
Okay. So we did not know at that time, even if what Representative Kobayashi is saying.
Is now true. So at that
We did
time,
not know.
and then by further follow-up, at the direction of Auditor Kondo, there was to be no further follow-up on the alleged forged document.
As far as I remember.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Rep.
Rep.
Kobayashi.
Kobayashi, again, you can continue with your questions.
So I have no further questions. Just a comment that what is so disappointing about this all is that our profession has a strong commitment to integrity. That's all we're really worth. And if you understand what the situation is and you continue to help it paint a picture that is inaccurate in terms of what you understand as an auditor's responsibility, and what I know you would understand given your experience in this as an auditor on what's happening here and how you're supporting that, it's just really disappointing. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Rep. Kobayashi. Rep. Yamashita?
Chair, I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, Rep. Perruso.
Hi, Mr. Shigeki. Thank you for joining us. So I do have a question about contracts submitted to the auditor and omitted from the report.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you too clearly.
So I have questions about the request for contracts funded by SLDF. So what did the audit team ask for and receive a list of contracts funded by SLDF?
Are you referring to the scope of the audit? Are you referring to?
I'm asking about materials that the audit team requested from DLNR with respect to the contracts funded by SLDF.
Contract for consultants or?
Contracts funded by SLDF, so funded by the Special Land Development Fund.
That part of the audit, we had contracted a CPA firm to look at contracts that were in excess of $100,000.
Okay, and that analysis was not included in the audit.
It was included, the results of the audit of that firm was included as part of the audit.
But not the list of the contracts.
What they looked at, you mean what
Correct.
actual contracts they looked at?
Right.
If there was no findings in those contracts they look at, it was not part of the audit. It wasn't included in the audit.
Okay. And so is that
So
a
our
normal
audit,
practice?
I'm sorry, our audit team focused on the leases, the permits, and the planning, the strategic plan, the asset management plan. The part that we contracted out with the CPA firm was looked at the financial activities of the fund, which included the procurement part, which is so they were instructed to look at contracts that were in excess of $100,000. And if they had no findings in their sample, then it would not be included in the report.
Okay, that's very helpful. So then you're really looking at the income, the revenue generated. That
Yeah.
was, and because you felt that it was the most risky area.
Yes.
Okay,
I mean, the financial part is important too, and that's why we contracted that part out, because it was such a large and complex audit, because we had to look at both funds, the Sldf and the Land Conservation Fund. And if we were to finish within the time allotted, we decided that it would be better to maybe contract out a firm to do the financial activities of that particular fund.
understood. Thank you.
Did I skip over? I apologize. Rep. Hashem, go ahead.
Mr. Shigi, would you, now that you know all that information about the items that were omitted, if you were the auditor, would you put it in the audit? I'm just curious. If it
Yes,
was your call.
yes.
Okay. Second question is, you gave a lot of information about details of who worked on the audit. But the committee couldn't get any information from the auditor because the auditor continues to cite that it's confidential information. Is that confident, in your opinion, is the information you gave confidential, or where does that confidentiality go? I mean, what is?
I think the confidentiality goes to the work papers that were developed during the audit. You know, the actual work papers itself. The actual work done by the audit team. I think that's what the statute refers to.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Representative Hashem. Vice Chair.
Just following up on Representative Hashem's question about what is considered, can you hear me?
No.
I wanted to follow up on Representative Hashem's question about what is considered confidential. You mentioned that in your role as the administrative deputy auditor, that you were in charge of contracts for the Office of the Auditor.
Yes,
And so, for example, would that have included the KKDLY contract as a part of the SLDF audit?
yes. That's the firm we contracted to do the audit of the financial activities of the fund.
And it's a customary practice for the auditor's office to contract with outside auditing firms to do this type of work?
I'm sorry?
Is it a normal customary practice for the Office of the Auditor to contract with outside firms to do this type of work?
Yes. Yes, we, to do the financial audit of the departments, we maybe administer over 20 different contracts with CPA firms.
And
So
I'm-
it's not unusual for us to contract with CPA firms. And as I had mentioned, that because of the size and complexity of this particular audit, and the time allotted, we decided to use a CPA firm to do the financial part.
And are those contracts funded out of the budget of the state auditor?
Yes. This particular audit is,
Okay, so then I think just laying that foundation, circling back to Rep. Hashem's question, would you consider the contract between the auditor and KKDLY confidential?
to my knowledge, the contracts, once they're executed, is a public document. As far as I know.
And so when you're in your role as administrative deputy auditor, you viewed those contracts between the auditor and external accounting firms as public documents?
Yes.
Okay.
In my opinion, I'm not sure.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
I'm gonna circle back. Chair Tarnas.
Thank you, Chair. Again, another process question. We understood that we understand that the draft report that was provided to the auditee included the findings, but not recommendations. Is that standard practice? I know we keep referring to the yellow book, standards, but what's your professional opinion on that?
The yellow book standards, as far as a finding is concerned, has 4 criteria as to what a finding is. It tells the criteria is like there's a condition, the criteria, the cause, and the effect. That is the development of a finding. The condition is what the auditor found out. If it's a lack of, let's say, an asset management plan in this particular case, or a strategic plan, or that type of thing, as far as that would be the condition. The criteria could be a law, or a law in the statutes, or Hawaii administrative rules, or maybe poor internal controls, or best practice, accounting practice. That would be the criteria for writing a finding. In this particular case, if I remember right, I think the rules required some kind of strategic plan or asset management plan. So that would be the criteria. The cause would be why didn't they do this? It could be lack of resources, lack of understanding, or they just didn't know. So the cause is a critical part. And then, and the final part of this finding is, what is the effect of the finding? How does this affect the operations of the department? So those are the yellow book standards as to what constitutes a finding when auditors develop a finding. The auditors also make recommendations. I think the recommendations are critical to the agency because recommendations address what the cause of the finding was. So if we identify the cause and we make a recommendation to address the cause, that will be helpful to the department to correct any deficiencies. By leaving the recommendations out of the report, I think it doesn't do justice to the department itself, not having the recommendation. Because seeing the recommendation and knowing the cause of it, then they can more appropriately act or develop an action plan to address those recommendations. So I think it's, as far as I know, in my practice, we always included the recommendations as part of the overall draft report.
So you find that that's the most effective way to have the audit be a tool that can improve efficiency of government operations if you include the recommendations in the draft and then share that with the auditee.
Exactly, in case if they have questions, and the recommendations are in there. It's a good time at either the exit conference to say why we recommended these things, because it's addressing why these findings occurred, which is what is the cause.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Back to you, Chair.
Representative Okimoto.
Thank you, Chair. No questions at this time.
Representative Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Shigi, one of the premises for really the basis of this investigation, really direction looking at the auditor's performance instead of really the agencies that we're looking at improving, is this perception that I think is embraced by lay people about the yellow book, that it's being held up as a Bible of absolute laws that any violation of or deviation from is just an egregious act. Obviously, you understand auditing and that we have standards, and that those standards are very malleable in terms of how you deal with different situations. I mean, it's not, as you obviously understand, given your years of experience, auditing is not as black and white as it might be framed here. That the reason we have standards in auditing, whether it's for public, private, governmental agencies, is because it's always, the rule has always been, it depends, right? In some certain situations, certain standards might be more applicable than others, and there's always has to be leeway and judgment in the profession of auditing. So do you agree with that, or do you want to continue that the Yellow Book is just an absolute Bible that cannot be flexible at all?
You know, the auditor uses professional judgment. The Yellow Book is not the absolute end of, you know, the standard that, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, thank you.
The Yellow Book is like a framework that outlines what the standards should be, but there's always going to have to interject the auditor's professional judgment and experience in applying the standards.
Thank you for clarifying that, because really when you're being brought on as an expert witness, as an auditor on this, and anything that you know, whether it relates to a direct question you're asked that affects the perception of whether there was any wrongdoing in the audit by Les Condo, should be said. It should be said, whether you're asked directly or not. And your opinions on the Yellow Book as not an absolute guide of definite laws and more as a flexible set of standards depending on circumstances is key to this. So I'm glad you brought that out. Thanks very much. I have no further questions.
Okay. Representative Hashem. Representative Yamashita.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Shigi, when you said you worked in the private sector as well as in the state auditor's office. So working in the state auditor's office, which is a legislative agency, are there standards or even responsibilities that your office, when you're working there, has as a government agency to report things that may affect government operations or may violate government tax law or things like that? Is there a standard or a responsibility that the office has to the state and being an agency of the legislature to the legislature to report that?
Are we talking about anything or?
When you find something that is of concern that may affect state government or government in general?
During the course of an audit?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea to inform the legislature or the committee, particular committee that requested a particular.
In your work in the past, under the previous auditor, was that a common practice?
Not that I remember. No, I can't remember.
Okay, but in your opinion, you think that is
I think in the course of an audit and we come across things, I think it would be good to, especially if it's critical to government operations, I think it would be good to at least inform the committee, the particular, maybe not the entire legislature, but the committee or involved or in crafting that request for an audit.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Rep. Yamashita. Rep. Perruso?
Can you circle back to me?
Excuse me?
Can you circle back to me?
Okay. Rep. Ichiyama?
Mr. Shigi, are you familiar with a former DLNR employee by the name of Keith Chun?
Yes,
Did you, or to your knowledge, any member of the audit team meet with Mr. Chun at any phase of the audit process for the SLDF audit?
yes, we did meet with Keith Chun during our planning phase.
And do you recall how that meeting came about?
How that meeting came about? I don't remember. He might have said that he'd be open to discussing with us his thoughts about the audit.
Okay,
I don't know if you remember that Keith Chun had applied at the office of the auditor with two other former employees of DLNR. But Keith wasn't. I guess they decided not to make an offer of employment to Keith.
and do you remember any chance if this interview or meeting with Mr. Chun was recorded or taped?
I think it was. I don't remember, but I'm sure. I think it was recorded. But we do have. I know we took a lot of notes, and Keith had shared some of his concerns about the land division.
Can you be maybe a little bit more specific about what was discussed at the meeting?
Sorry, I don't remember.
Generally, that he had concerns about the land division.
Yes. Yes. In fact, we might have met with him twice.
And do you recall if you were in those meetings personally,
Yes, I was.
in both meetings?
Yes.
Do you recall who attended the first meeting with you, or is it just you by yourself?
I think the audit team was. Members of the audit team that I mentioned were in the meeting with Mr. Chun.
And Auditor Kondo?
He may not have been.
And for the second meeting with Mr. Chun, do you recall who was present?
It's to be members of the audit team. And I don't remember whether Auditor Kondo was at that meeting. I just don't remember.
And were both of those meetings during the planning phase?
Yes.
To the best of your recollection, were those meetings with Mr. Chun and the concerns that he brought up, did that inform or?
I'm sorry, what is the question again?
So to the best of your recollections, the concerns that Mr. Chun brought up during those meetings, during the planning stage, did that inform or perhaps shape some of the investigation by the audit staff as to the scope of the audit or areas of concern?
We took it into consideration, whatever he told us. Maybe it verified what our planning process was going to be, and he was like, yeah, that's the area. So yeah, it was just an additional confirmation that we were looking and we're going to test the right places.
And then this is my last question, Chair. In addition to Mr. Chun, did the audit team meet with any other former DLNR employees? To the best
No.
of your recollection?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it, Mr. Shigi.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I'm gonna circle back through the list, and I have one last set of questions. So last round of questions. Chair Tarnas,
Want to go to Rep.
Rep. Perruso.
So this is a follow-up question. The reason I was interested in the contracts is I'm interested in the way in which those monies are allocated. And it goes back to the question of revenue from ceded lands. So I took great interest in the section of the audit that addressed the ways in which DLNR was choosing to appropriate or put 80% of those funds back into its own accounts and for its own programs. And so I'm curious about whether on your team there was any discussion of diving deeper into this question, because I think that you're touching the edge of something when you talk about that. And there was a section that addressed it, but I'm wondering like if the team felt that this was a broader issue that deserved additional attention.
Are you talking about the OHA revenues?
I am.
Okay, the OHA revenues portion.
But not the OHA revenues portion, the remainder.
The remainder. That part of the audit was conducted by the CPA firm itself. As far as the
So your team did not discuss it?
the audit team were looking more into the leases and revocable permits and how they were handled or managed.
Okay.
Okay, but the actual collection of the revenues into the fund and subsequent disbursement or allocation was handled by the consulting firm. And
so
I believe they had a finding in that area in the report.
They did. I was just wondering the extent to which your team grappled with that. And if you felt it was an issue that deserved more attention. So what you're saying is that basically the two audits were fairly separate and only brought together in the report. So you did not discuss their findings and synthesize them, really.
We developed the scope of their work. So they were in discussions with us as they did their work. So it's not like they were completely on their own.
But when they came to their conclusions, you didn't then have large group discussions with the team about the
we did not.
Thank you.
Any further questions? All right, so we're going to the last round. Chair Tarnas.
Thank you. Just following up on Rep. Ichiyama's question, is there a requirement or not a requirement? Is there guidance from the Yellow Book standards about disclosure to the auditee? For example, if you met with Keith Chun, who provided information, he didn't work for the auditor's office. He was actually a former employee of the land division. Is that something that you need to disclose to the auditee as standard practice?
Not that I know of.
Not necessarily. Okay. And then last question. You submitted your draft report to the auditor, and then there was some time, you don't remember how long, and then the final report that was produced. It's clearly the auditor's job to go through and make whatever changes he feels are necessary. But do you remember, was there a significant difference between the draft you put in and the final that came out?
I don't think there were significant changes.
Okay.
Maybe just the style.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Rep. Okimoto.
Thank you, Chair. No questions.
Okay, Rep. Kobayashi, last questions?
Thank you, Chair. So part of the questioning on really the what they call the independent review process, otherwise known as referencing, would be that seems focused on the timing of it. So when you, and also that there should be, I think there's some way of framing it so that independent review or process is basically, there's one objective to make sure that everything in the report is properly supported. But you really give the impression that it's a two-way process, that the independent reviewer will also look at what's in the working papers to ensure that it should be in the report if it's significant. I've never known that as part of the referencing process, which would increase the scope of the independent review process massively. I mean, it's something you basically do in a day. But to say that you need to verify, look at everything in the work papers and find out that, oh, there's significant things there, why is it not in the report?
I don't think I said
A
that.
ridiculous premise. I mean, you need to make clear that the independent review process to make sure that everything in the report is supported and not a two-way process the other way around.
Right, I didn't say that. I said everything in the report is supported by a work paper.
That's right. And the process does not involve ensuring that everything that they may find in the work papers that they would think significant, because the independent reviewer won't even look in the work papers except to make sure that they're supporting something in the report. It's not like they'd have a general review of the work papers to make sure. And I think that's what the impression here was that there are things in the work papers and you guys should have put it in the report. And the independent reviewer would have caught that. But that would never happen because it's not a two-way process. Would you agree?
That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, Rep. Hashem?
So you kind of sparked my curiosity because you said you would have put the stuff inside there. So just what, in your opinion, do you think there's any misleading statements in the audit? How would you have written it differently? Or if you were the auditor, what would you do different? Or what information would you add that's not in there that?
You're talking about the two incidents, the two occurrences?
That too, like, because the audit goes up to the auditor and they make the final call on what gets in and out, right? And as you sift through the information.
Usually what goes to the auditor is pretty much what's in. It's.
So my question, basically, how would you have written the audit different? Or if you had a chance?
I think the audit report itself is a solid report. It's whether or not we should have maybe pursued those two other areas more diligently instead of we didn't pursue it, so we didn't have enough information or evidence to put it into the report, or to include in the report. So I can't tell
I
you
see.
that.
So the direction would have gone different.
Yeah, direction, yes.
I see.
If we have more evidence and we had backup for it, then maybe it should go into the report. But if we didn't, then because we didn't go down that road, we didn't pick up enough information
Okay.
to
I
be
see.
included in the report.
So you would have guided the audit in a different direction, I guess, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand.
Rep. Yamashita? Okay, Rep. Perruso, one more time.
We had a discussion about the issue of fraud in the form of forgery. And I wanted to go to the second issue, the issue you identified with the lapse of the nonprofit status. So I just wanted to clarify or to make sure that I understood. You thought that that was an unusual enough or significant enough issue that it should have been pursued, but it was not.
It could have been.
It could have been. Is this something that you have seen before, the lapse of the nonprofit status in a lease, in a lessee?
I'm sorry?
Have you seen that before? Has it come up before in other audits?
No, I have not.
Okay. And can you remind the public again why that's significant? So the kind of preferential treatment afforded to nonprofits?
Well, there's twofold, whether or not, because that particular nonprofit has lost its status, I wasn't sure then, would that lease agreement be still valid since it was signed to be with a nonprofit agency? And the second part would be certain nonprofits do get better rent rates because of their status. But I'm not sure again on this particular nonprofit because we didn't pursue it any further.
So that's still a question left unanswered, whether or not they were getting a preferential.
Yeah,
rent rate.
I did not look into whether they were getting a lower rent rate than fair market value.
Just, so the team decided not to pursue that? The team decided not to pursue that?
No. Auditor Kondo decided not to pursue it.
Thank you.
Rep. Ichiyama, last question. Okay, so my last set of questions, members, and then we can wrap up this portion. I just want to circle back to something that Rep. Kobayashi said and clarify, because I think maybe what the question he was asking was actually rephrasing what I had understood the process of the independent review, which has now since been clarified, which is the independent review is only to make sure everything in the report is properly supported and is not to look for omissions, correct?
Correct.
All right, so the process of omissions, what to follow up in the course of the field work is a joint decision made by both the analyst in charge, the audit team, and ultimately the decision of the auditor. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So it ultimately lands with the auditor to determine what to investigate or what to, audit or what not to audit.
He makes the final decision because he has the ultimate responsibility for the report itself.
Okay, I want to shift to the planning phase because I believe that there had been a testimony received earlier by Chair Case and Mr. Suji that they had engaged in some planning phase meetings with the audit team, and you acknowledged that as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you recall if at this planning meetings, whether DLNR provided you with a list of contracts before you started to dive into your field work?
I don't recall.
Okay. But if they had provided that to you, that would have been acknowledged and dated and received by the audit team. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then if you had this complete list of contracts, would you have then taken it back to a weekly status meeting and reviewed that list of contracts?
We're talking about contracts that are with outside vendors, or are we talking about contracts that are leases?
I think what I'm talking about, because in the earlier testimony, the direction of the bill was to examine contracts just broadly.
The procurement of contracts.
Yes.
That's correct.
Yes. So at some point, there was a decision made to focus on the RPs and leases, which I think is a wise decision because the contracts are just so immense.
Right.
But I just need to understand if at any point, was DLNR ready to talk about a broader range of contracts, and then they provided you that information, if you can recall?
I'm sorry, I can't recall
Okay,
that part.
that's fine. It's again a long time ago. Another set of questions on the planning phase. In questioning the auditor, we questioned and asked about whether there were any meetings with legislators to determine the scope. I understand, and can you explain, is that a common practice to meet with key legislators prior to beginning an audit?
Yes.
And how do you conduct those meetings with legislators, and do you document those meetings?
We would meet with usually the introducer of the bill, and anybody he decides to invite. We will go over, first of all, we'll go over their concerns on why this bill was constructed, and as far as documentation, we will take minutes of meetings, and it probably was recorded, because that's the new practice now, is that they probably record every meeting.
Do you recall having any meetings with legislators in the SLDF audit?
Did we have, I'm sorry?
Do you recall participating in any planning meetings with legislators for the SLDF audit?
Yes, we had, I believe, a couple of meetings with Representative Yamani
Okay,
to go over his concerns, scope of the audit, and, the direction where we're going with the audit.
okay. And any other legislators?
Not that I remember. I think it was only with Representative Yamani.
Primarily Representative Yamani, okay.
There might have been others.
So there might have been other meetings where you were not a part of?
No, I was always be a part. If it's going to be a meeting with a legislator, I would always be a part of that meeting.
Okay, thank you. So one last question, and again, I really appreciate the information you have shared with us, because you have shed a lot of light on the process of the SLDF audit and the findings and recommendations. Representative Kobayashi was referring to the Yellow Book standards not being the end all. It's simply a guide, in some ways, a framework. And then you said that professional judgment was really important. Can you explain further what professional judgment means in accordance with the Yellow Book standard?
Well, the standard itself is, again, it's a broad guide to how to conduct audits. And there's a section on performance audits within the Yellow Book, but it doesn't dwell into the details on how to do a risk assessment. It just generalizes what a risk assessment should include. So every audit, every performance audit is going to be different.
Mhm.
So it's going to be left to the professional judgment of the auditor on how to craft these areas of risk assessment depending on the program that we're auditing. So again, it provides the framework, but it
Okay.
doesn't delve into this is what you have to do.
Sure, but the concept of professional judgment, can you explain what the concept of professional skepticism might be? Is that something that you're aware of as a part of professional judgment?
Professional skepticism is that, to explain it simply, I guess, it's that we don't accept whatever we're told without, just blindly. We will seek more if someone tells us this, and this, we don't say, oh, that must be correct. We will try to get more documentation to see whatever that person is telling us is correct. So that would be professional skepticism. We don't believe everything the auditee says.
And it doesn't matter who you're talking to or interviewing. You apply that professional skepticism both ways.
Usually with the auditee.
Okay. All right, I think that's all I have. Members, any further questions? So, Mr. Shigi, thank you very much for coming and providing critical information to this committee. Just by way of further guidance, I believe we may have asked all the questions we need to, but the committee is still actively investigating. And as I've said, we continue to receive more and more documents. So there might be a chance that we have to recall you in the event that we discover more information or need further clarification. So in that event, would you be available? And then we can certainly work with your schedule to accommodate if the committee needs to see you further.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay. Thank you again, Mr. Shigi. We have been going, members, now for about an hour and a half. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we are in recess now. Thank you.
Thank
Reconvening our hearing on October 20th, 2021 of the House Investigative Committee. Members, we have our second testifier today. Chair Suzanne Case is rejoining our testimony testifiers. She has been brought before the committee to testify specifically on matters related to misconduct found and prosecuted pursuant to Attorney General Report number 16-5227 and the measures taken by the Department of Land and Natural Resources in response to this Attorney General's report. Welcome, Chair Case. Thank you for joining us today. I have to swear you in again, so if you could please stand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let the record reflect that Chair Case answered in the affirmative. Chair Case, so in the process of conducting this investigative committee's work, we learned about an incident of a potentially forged document that was discovered by the audit team sometime in between 2017 and 2018 when the field work was being conducted. What I'd like to do is understand the background behind this forged document. And so we're going to explore some of those questions and then the steps that were taken to investigate, prosecute, and resolve this very serious misconduct. So how did this forged document become discovered, and approximately when was it discovered by your offices?
Sure, and just to clarify, it wasn't discovered by the audit team. Maybe they discovered it in the process, but we had discovered it a year before the audit started. So what happened was we were notified at the end of August 2016 by Title Guarantee that they had a question about a survey attached to a recorded easement that didn't look right. And could we take a look at it? I think that was August 30th, 2016. And we looked at it and pretty quickly decided that it looked wrong. It looked like maybe the signatures were made up. And so we referred it to the Attorney General's office right away. I think it was September 9, 2016, and asked them to investigate. We didn't really know what the story was on it, but it looked funky. So it was an easement that the land board had approved a year before, September 25th, 2015. And a landowner had requested a year before that. So the land board approved it, subject to the landowner who requested it, an easement across state land, paying for an appraisal and a survey. So it had not been finalized. So so this recorded document came in, and the AG Investigative Division looked at it and did interviews over the next few months. And by sort of mid-December had concluded that a now former land agent had confessed to forging the document. And so we right away requested, I don't know how long you want me, if you want me to continue, I can just do that whole outline. We put him on administrative leave without pay and started an official Attorney General administrative investigation on the same matter, basically a continuation of that, but focused on this particular land agent as the potential forger. And so after 30 days, we had to put him on leave with pay per his bargaining unit agreement. And then on March 7, 2017, he resigned. And the AG Investigative Division continued with the investigation just to wrap it up and to just make sure that this was an isolated incident. And so we got the report at the end of April 2017, and then they turned it over to the Criminal Investigative Division, and that was the end of it from our side.
Are you aware if there was a criminal prosecution?
I'm aware now. I was made aware in my audit interview in October 2018. I was briefly questioned about it. So I was made aware that there was a criminal notation in the criminal records about it. But again, we didn't have anything to do with it once it left. Once our administrative investigation was done and the employee no longer worked there, so our part of it was done.
Okay. Were you aware that it had been prosecuted at that time in October 2018 and fully resolved?
I had no. The only knowledge I had was it had been turned over to the Criminal Investigative Division in probably May 2017. And then I was made aware that there was a criminal notation, and no, I didn't have any further knowledge of it.
Okay, when it was brought to your attention on October 2018, did you do anything further to follow up on the fact that there was a criminal notation of the case?
No, not on the criminal, nothing on the criminal side.
Did you do anything to follow up on the status of the forged document still being noted?
Yes.
And can you explain what you did?
Yes, so the auditor, the analyst, who was Ryan Hurley, we had a brief conversation about it, and he asked about the recorded document still being on record, which we don't, once we don't have any knowledge of that, because once we approve and finalize an easement document or any document, if it's a conveyance to somebody, they're the ones responsible for recording the documents. So we have our records about the land board approval, the appraisal, the survey, the documentation, the Attorney General review of the document, and then it's finalized. So in this case, there was in fact a recorded document which we didn't have knowledge of, and I didn't know. Actually, I mean, we did have knowledge, I guess, of it in 2016, but it wasn't on our radar. We don't have a system for that, and so he brought to our attention that it was still on the public record. So we immediately made a request to the Attorney General's office to start a process for whatever you do to expunge it or get it off the public record. But it's nothing we ever have experience with.
And do you know if that expungement process has been finalized?
I don't believe it has been finalized. We are in current discussions again with the Attorney General's office about it to follow up with it, but I think it's a pretty complicated process. I think you have to do a court proceeding to verify it. So it's not like you can just go to the recorder's office and say, hey, this is a forged document, please take it off the record. There's a whole process that I'm not familiar with to ensure that it really is forged and that there's not, other people have due process rights to contest that.
So it's correct to say that the DLNR has taken steps to correct the public record and removed the forged easement.
We've taken the steps that we can take, yes.
Okay. Now, on the part of having discovered the forgery, what steps did DLNR take to address whether this was a systemic problem or potentially just a single act of misconduct?
So we did ask the Attorney General's investigative division to just continue with the investigation to confirm whether this was looked like a one-off versus something more systemic. And also, I believe our assistant administrator, Kevin Moore, looked around in the records to see if there was anything else that looked funky. But it was such an unusual incident that, we didn't see any pattern.
Did you ever receive a report from the Aegis investigation on that issue of whether it was systemic or just a singular act?
The administrative investigation report we received at the end of April 2017 confirmed their view that it was an isolated incident.
Did you ever receive anything from the criminal division?
No.
Okay. Have you ever seen the criminal report?
I saw it for the first time. I received it Friday, a redacted version that had been released. And I received that Friday and I looked at it starting Sunday evening and looked at it some more Monday and Tuesday.
Okay. Members, I want to give you the opportunity to ask any questions because this is a serious incident that was handled, was discovered, handled, rediscovered by the auditor's office, and then not included in the report for reasons as yet unknown to us. But I do want to provide you folks with the opportunity to ask any questions. So starting with Chair Tarnas.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I have questions on other matters, so not on this one particular. So if you want to go around to
Okay.
others.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. No questions at this time.
Rep Hashem, Rep Yamashita, no, Rep Perruso. Oh, sorry, Rep Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. Director Case, if we follow this, what you're saying about you had a meeting with the auditors regarding the fraudulent email, that's kind of at odds with what we just heard from Ron Shige, who says that he was completely unaware that this had even been addressed, brought to the Attorney General's, let alone be turned over the criminal division. Was he present at these meetings or was it just Hurley?
I don't recall. I think that meeting may have been Mr. Hurley, Mr. Kawahara, or I can't remember his name, and possibly Mr. Shigi. This is my second audit interview in October 2018.
But it was something that was raised at the time. Did you give any indication that you thought that this would be helpful to include in the audit report? Or, I mean, would that be your call to really request that things are or are not included in the audit report?
No, this was about a 2-minute conversation. And the conversation was about, number one, how did you, Mr. Hurley had this information somehow. And number two, he wanted to know, had we taken the forged easement off the record? That's all the discussion was.
So do you think anything would have played out differently if they had disclosed this already discovered issue in the audit report? I mean, would you have approached it any differently? Because it's in the audit report?
I don't have an opinion about that.
Okay, so it might have changed the way everything happened had this already discovered issue been included in the audit report.
I don't have any opinion about that.
Okay, thank you.
Rep. Kobayashi, and just for members of the committee, we are fortunate that we have a copy of this October 2018 interview. And it does confirm, Rep. Kobayashi, that the conversation was maybe 2 minutes, and there was no discussion about the fact that this had already been criminally prosecuted. So at that time, Representative Kobayashi, I think the evidence demonstrates to us that at least in the conversation with Chair Case, knowledge about whether it had been fully prosecuted was not evident to members of the audit team. So that now conforms with the testimony that Mr. Shiigi presented just previously, that he had no knowledge of the completed criminal prosecution. So that's the state of the record at that time. Any further questions?
Well, let me
Kobayashi?
continue, if I may. So his testimony was that he wasn't even aware that this had come to light and that it had been referred to the Attorney General. So you can't equate knowledge of criminal prosecution with knowledge of this event being known by management. I mean, basically, you come up with some irregularity. Maybe, although they're auditors and not investigators, there might be some reason to say that, okay, yeah, it should be brought to attention of management. But whether it's criminally prosecuted or not, if they're already aware of it, they are, right? I mean, it's not a secret. Everybody knows about this. I don't know why you can focus on the criminal prosecution aspect when the whole thing is, well, did they find out about this and say nothing, which is kind of the implication here, or does that hurt the process? Was it a hiding of any significant evidence, or is it just, of course they didn't say anything because everybody knew about it, whether it's criminally prosecuted or not. Management was aware of it, and they were aware that it went to the Attorney General. It was criminally
Okay,
prosecuted.
thank you. Is there a question, Rep. Kobayashi? Well, we can, if there's no question, we'll move on to Rep. Hashem. Rep. Perruso.
I have questions, but they're on other matters.
Okay, well, Rep. Yamashita, I'm sorry to skip you, I'm Rep. Ichiyama.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Director Case, for being here. And I just want to say, first of all, that we really appreciate your candor and the way that the department handled the entire situation, and your openness and transparency. This committee is much appreciated. I think that from what we've heard on how the department handled the incident, the department did everything correctly. The only question that I have, and I just want to make it very clear, is whether or not at any time you ask the auditors not to put this in the report or not to ask any questions about it. I just want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of that scenario.
I did not ask the auditors not to include it in the report.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Case. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, any more questions on the issue of the forged easement and the department's actions following or their interactions with the auditor around the forged easement? Okay. Let me just clarify for the record, because timeline is now becoming very important about who knew what, when, and what did they do. Who knew what, when, and what did they do? And this is for all of the persons involved in the audit. We also have the benefit of having the September 29, 2017 interview recording with Ms. Melissa Loy and I believe Ms. Sophie Koch. At any point in that interview, was there mention of a finding of the fraudulent easement?
I don't believe so.
Okay. And that would have been around September 2017. And then it was October 2018 that was first an inquiry from an audit analyst, Ryan Hurley, about the fraudulent easement, correct? Okay. And then just to further follow up, in our initial hearings with you, did anyone in your office ever receive a letter or communication from the auditor or the audit team about any follow-up with this forged easement and what the department had done to address it?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. All right. Any other comments you would like to make on this forged easement before we move on to other questions?
No, I mean, it was a unfortunate situation. I do believe it was an isolated incident. It was a very odd incident. And, you know, if somebody intentionally does something wrong like this, it's hard to discover. It's not like, you know, you have systems in place to make sure everybody follows the right procedures. If somebody's intentionally going completely around them, those are hard to discover. And we were very fortunate that Title Guarantee asked the question about the survey, and we did pretty much immediately check it out and try to get it investigated.
Thank you. And I want to echo Vice Chair's comments that we appreciate the candor of this department in explaining what steps were taken when this fraud was detected. I'd like to move on to other questions, members. I'm going to indulge. It was not noticed for this hearing, but since we have time, I will open it up to other questions. Chair Tarnas.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to follow up on something that, well, because of legislation we passed this past session about lease extensions and reading the audit and their criticisms of DLNR for over relying on lease extensions and not seeking to even consider ways to increase revenue. Could you explain to us, because the law says in the bill we just passed as well, you may extend the leases. We gave you some guardrails this last time around about percentage of what kind of improvements need to be made and the value has to meet a certain threshold. But how do you respond to the auditor's criticism that you're just over-relying on lease extensions and you're not getting a fair return? How do you balance that? And tell us about that, because that's a core issue that we're grappling with here.
I think balance balance and analysis is the crux of it. You know, these are issues, they're issues of public policy. There are pluses and minuses on both sides of these issues. And so we have, you know, serious analysis and debate at the staff level, at the chair level, and at the board level on all of these. And we have all along. So, you know, from many years ago. So, and I believe the first extension that was, and this was before my time, but it's my understanding that the law was passed and the staff, you know, heard and debated different approaches to it. And actually is my understanding, and I again, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong because I wasn't there, but that the staff recommended against it and the land board debated it and approved it. And so that, again, and we spoke about this last time, was an indication from the legislature and from the board that we should go in this direction. So if it looks like somebody qualifies and it's a policy decision, then that's generally what we do. But we do have discussion at the again, staff and chair and board level about, is this something that is going to benefit the public? And part of benefiting the public is getting a good, stable revenue stream. And part of benefiting part of doing it right is making sure that we can do what we're doing, that it qualifies under the statute. So, ideas about changing the lease form, you have to look and see if that's allowed under the statute, that kind of thing. So there is a lot of debate. I'm rambling a little bit, but so tell me if that answers your question or if there's anything else.
No, I mean, I appreciate just your commentary on that because of the criticism that you're just extending leases as the default decision. But your description of your critical review would inform me that in fact there's different criteria that you use to determine whether it's in the best interest of the state to do that. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Right. It's a pretty thorough process and it's laid out pretty thoroughly in the submittals that go to the board.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Chair.
Rep Okimoto?
Thank you, Chair. No comments.
Rep Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. So just following up on what Representative Tarnas was asking on the leases. So there, I guess the context of my question is analysis that had been provided that shows that in a majority of the cases, there could be greater revenue obtained from these leases had they gone back out rather than just carte blanche extension. And there had been some discussion by other administrators about questioning whether income maximization would be appropriate as a goal for these leases when they're doing these extensions. Do you have a sense of what factors, obviously there are many, you mentioned one being just reliability and consistency of revenue. I think there's no business minds that would disagree with that as being objective as well. But for each of these extensions, were these criteria applied to each one? Because it seems like they weren't looked at on a case-by-case basis so much as just everything was extended. But was there any documented review of each of these extensions and the reasons why it would not make sense to go after, to at least check out if market rent was obtainable?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And I would say that the proposition that you can get more money by going out to public auction is highly speculative. It depends on you got to weigh, if you have a good, solid paying tenant, steady revenue stream, no material defaults versus, ending that lease, starting all over. It takes quite a while to go through the public auction process. Oftentimes people are reluctant to bid in a state public auction process. You have to reappraise and set a base price and, you don't have the ability to negotiate with prospective tenants on terms that they might need that might be different from others. So it is a highly speculative process. And so that's what you're weighing. I think, if somebody requests an extension, part of what you are thinking about is, has anybody else expressed any interest in that particular parcel? And, usually the case is not. And so, again, it's an analysis you go through. You look at the finances, the procedures, the policy declarations, and make your best judgment about what's right for the public in this case.
Thank you. So if we could just have some kind of, I guess the answer makes a lot of sense, but it is kind of still a carte blanche thing that say, okay, if nobody raises their hand and says they want that property or they have interest in it, and we do have a good tenant there, then we should just extend it.
It's a very case-by-case process. And when you go to the board, you're in full sunshine. You're in a publicly agendized meeting, noticed. And if somebody, said, hey, why are you extending this lease? I want it. They have a full opportunity to do that. And so that is, one of the safeguards put in place to make sure that we are making the best really business decision for the state on it.
Thank you, Director. No more questions.
Rep Hashem, Rep Yamashita, Rep Perruso.
Yeah, I have one additional question that goes back to our earlier conversation about the ceded land revenues. And on page 38 and 39 of the audit report, in like a set aside text box, this issue is analyzed. The recommendation of the auditor in this section is that DLNR should seek guidance from the legislature about whether the department is authorized to keep and spend ceded land revenues without specific legislative approval to do so. And I'm wondering, I have two questions. So, and the first is, have you done that?
So if I may, I want to just make sure we're clear on which part of it we're talking about, because we get revenues in, and we from all of our revenues. Some of them are ceded lands revenues, and some are not.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that are ceded lands revenues, we take 20% and basically put it in the pot that all of the state agencies put into. And from that, OHA gets a $15.1 million payment. So that is the portion that is available to pay OHA on whatever the legislative judgment is, which is right now $15.1 million a year. It's not a 20% thing. It's just, that's the calculation. That's the pot. And so there was a finding, I believe there was a finding about had we released those into the general fund, and we did follow up, and I'm a little unclear. So if I'm wrong, I can correct it. But that we did follow up with Budget and Finance and did complete that release of the excess in that pot into the general fund.
Okay, so that you are, the remainder from those ceded land revenues are going into the general fund, which is.
No, not the remainder. I'm talking about the 20%.
Oh, right. No, that was not part of.
Okay, so that's why I want to be clear on this.
Right. Okay.
The other part, 80% goes into the Special Land and Development Fund. By statute, we're supposed to fund our operations. So that's not part of that's not part of the all of the rest of the 80% of ceded land revenues and all of the other revenues that we get from lands that are not ceded lands go into the Special Land and Development Fund. And we are supposed to be making money to fund DLNR's operations. And we do that, with legislative authorization and direction and often specific line item directions as well. So that's all authorized by the legislature.
I am confused now because I don't think the situation is as clear as you might make it out to be. I think that the Special Land Development Fund, and I'm looking at the auditor's report, and this is a broader conversation. And your interpretation of ceded land revenues and the requirement of DLNR is simply that the 20% go to OHA.
And we have an AG advice letter on this.
So that's what I was asking about.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, so
and I believe you have that also.
Okay, I'll look for that. And so was that advice letter sought after this report was issued?
I don't know. Yes.
Okay.
So we clarified it. Yeah, we clarified it, and in response to the audit, I guess is the answer.
Thank you.
And so we confirmed that we're following the process that our AGs interpret as the correct one.
Okay. And that is your AG, the AG that works with your department?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you.
Ichiyama? Okay, last round of questions, members. Otherwise, we are continuing into November and December, so we can always recall Chair Case back. But this will put us at approximately noon. So if there are no further questions, I do have one question, just because I want to close the loop and it reflects discovery that we recently received. This goes back to the planning phase of the audit. I believe we received a document dated July 31st, 2017, and it appears to be a list of contracts, a pretty extensive list of contracts. In the early planning phases, Chair Case, did someone from your office provide this document to members of the audit team?
Yes.
Okay, and this would have been, these are documents DLNR-LD 012415 through one, 2, 4, 3, 4.
Yes.
Okay. And so to circle back to your previous testimony, this would have been provided to the audit team based upon DLNR's reading of the authorizing statute, which was to look at a broader range of contracts, including procurement contracts. Is that correct?
Yes.
And do you know, was there a conversation about this list and what the audit team would be focusing on as they proceeded with their field work? If you can recall.
What I believe is that that the contract review was part of the audit review, and it was required by the statute.
Okay, so this information was provided and your team was cooperative whenever
Yes.
the audit office asked for documents.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make one comment?
Yeah, yes, you may.
It would be nice if when we have audit review and there are no findings, that comment were included in a final audit, because if we're doing it right, I'd like to have the audit acknowledge that. That's a general comment.
That's a fair comment, and I believe you might be talking on behalf of many
Yes.
audited agencies across the state.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chair Case. I don't believe I have any further questions. I will say on this matter, Chair Case, again, thank you for your candor. Your office was not part of the criminal investigation committee member, so I do want to apprise you that very voluminous document is also in our possession. So there might be further follow-up, because now at this point, 2 different state agencies, in fact, investigated this matter. And we understand the department's view of how it was completed, but we don't actually understand some of the reasoning behind the criminal division's further investigation. And I believe we may also be missing a potential report from them that we'll be following up on, based upon what they have so far provided us. We won't do that now, members, because as I said, we are getting a voluminous number of documents coming in. In fact, we have documents received from ADC today. So our staff will go back and put that up onto the drive for members. In the meantime, members, I did want to provide a short so Chair Case, you are excused. Thank you very much. We will, you're welcome to stay as we wrap up the meeting. It'll only be a few more minutes. But we will likely call you back, and we understand your travel schedule in early November to deal with huge issues of global climate change. So we will work with your schedule accordingly. Members, I wanted to apprise you of an update on a matter pending before the courts. Mr. Kondo, as you've noticed, has not, and the Office of the Auditor has not responded to our subpoena of September 29th, 2021, I believe. We are still awaiting outstanding documents. Members, at this time, he has filed a motion to quash or enlarge time for provision of those documents. We have been assigned a hearing date and a judge. This matter will be set before Judge Cataldo on Wednesday, November 3rd at 9:00 a.m. My recommendation at this point, members, while we are authorized to take some actions pursuant to our rules to acquire the public documents that have been requested, I want to be clear, members, our position is that those are not working papers. Those are contracts by many of them are simply contracts that the auditor entered into to conduct the financial audits and a list of the work product that they were supposed to provide. We are not going to initiate any contempt proceedings at this point, although that is still available to us as we continue to move along. My recommendation is that we allow our committee to continue our work, and then let our very competent Attorney General handle the matter with the courts at this time, so that we are not further distracted and we can continue our work of following up on the findings and recommendations. Members, any discussion? I do want to provide opportunity for discussion or questions, if you have any questions. All right, members. So with that, we'll be adjourning. Tomorrow, we're going to be starting promptly at 9:30 a.m. With a lunch break, and then again at 1:30 p.m. With Mr. Keith Chun in the morning, and then members of ADC, Mr. James Nakatani and Ms. Myra Kaichi in the afternoon. Seeing no further business before this committee, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Good job.